With Donald Trump back in power, the future of transatlantic relations is entering a new chapter. The impact of America First policies, shifting priorities, and emerging geopolitical challenges will define the partnership with Europe for years to come. What will this mean for NATO? Will the future see deeper divisions over defense, trade, and shared values? Or can Europe and America find common ground again? And will Europe move toward unity, divide into separate blocs, or see the EU model collapse in favor of independent nation-states?
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, and valued audience, it is a pleasure to welcome you today to today's session. Today, we are especially delighted to host Nikolai Mildanov, Director of Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academies, whose extensive experience in diplomacy and international affairs will provide invaluable insights to our discussion. In this conversation, we'll delve into a timely and critical topic of Trump 2.0 and the future of transatlantic relations. With shifting global dynamics, evolving alliances, and strategic uncertainties, this discussion promises to be both insightful and thought-provoking. Let me first introduce our speaker guest. Mr. Nikolai Mildanov is a highly respected diplomat and expert in international affairs. Mr. Mildanov has held leadership roles at the United Nations, where he was appointed as a head of United Nations Assistant Mission for Iraq, and later UN Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace Process. In the European Union, Mr. Mildanov was a member of the Parliament. And of course, he performed political roles in his country of origin, Bulgaria, serving as Minister of Defense and later as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Currently in Abu Dhabi, he serves as the Director General of Anwar Gargash Academy, contributing to the development of our future diplomats and policy makers. With extensive experience in global security, peace building, and Middle East affairs, he brings insightful thoughts to our conversation today. Please join me in welcoming Nikolai Mildanov. As we aim to keep our conversation interactive and engaging, I will be opening the floor to your questions and comments during the conversation, not only at the end. Your Excellency, the first 2 months of Trump presidency were marked by a series of statements and policy shifts, sparking significant geopolitical impacts and tensions, particularly impacting regional dynamics in the Middle East, Europe, and America. My question, sir, in an area of international relations dictated by America First, to what extent do you think Mr. Trump would be able to reshape international politics? Would Hawks and his administration succeed in implementing their vision of how United States' role should be, or will he be limited by the constraints of the international system and resistant from the international community?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to have this conversation. It's great to be back here at ACCSR, and thank you for sort of delving right into the topic. I belong to, I guess, a very small group of people who still think it's too early to say that we are in an era, quote unquote, of a different international relations. I think we're going through a period, definitely, in which the United States is looking at its role in international relations in a different way than what we are used to. It was very exemplifying to listen to Secretary Rubio when he was being confirmed as Secretary of State, when he said that the international order that America helped create after the Second World War is now working against them. This was quite a radical statement. Now, that followed by what has happened most recently in the UN General Assembly, where the US voted against the European resolution on Ukraine, condemning Russia, shows that America sees its role in a different way. We hear constantly, both from the President and from his Secretary of State, that foreign policy is going to be transactional. And many in Europe and the rest of the world see this as a negative development.
Why is that?
Because they feel that, when you have a transactional policy, it is not based on principles and values on which foreign policy was based before. But in the eyes of the Trump administration, transactional is actually positive. So America sees its role not as the superpower that is there to set the rules for everybody, but as the superpower that is competing with other powers and acting as a more traditional nation state. Now, to answer your question is, will Trump be able to reshape international politics? There are a lot of reasons why perhaps he may not be able to reshape international politics. One, it's domestic politics in America. In about a year, this massive mandate that he has from the American people will probably change with the midterms in America, and his power will be slightly, at least, dented within the United States. Secondly, if you look at the very nature of voters in America, they haven't radically changed. Their views haven't radically changed over the last years. He did win the election, but
with a huge voice.
Exactly, but this does not mean that the vast majority of Americans have really shifted. What he represents is a part of America that until now was less represented, if I can use that term in policy circles. And thirdly, I think President Trump is quite unique in how he behaves and how he acts, and his charisma, his thinking, his attitude is very different from other politicians, and I'm not really sure that if you take President Trump out of the equation, that same line of thinking will become a trend in the long term. It may become, but it may not. And last but not least, I think that ultimately America, with all the transactional foreign policy that it wants to undertake now, with all the skepticism of multilateralism, with the trade wars and tariffs, ultimately you will see that behind all of that bluster, there is a certain logic to what the administration does in terms of addressing some of the gaps within the previous administration. So in a way, yes, America, in a way, I don't think America is retreating as much as it is returning to the international sphere, but in a different way, with a different view on how it sees itself. Whether that view will last or not, it's too early to say.
Well, that's interesting discussion. But since you mentioned the retreat from values and democratic values and moving to transactional policy, this brings this question. Many European leaders, especially from the left, saw Trump's presidency as a break from liberal democratic values due to his nationalistic rhetoric, climate policies, and approach to multilateralism. How will these ideological differences shape the US-EU relations, especially in light of the rise of the right in Europe? Let's take Germany for an example. What's the future of the liberal international order?
Let's separate that. I mean, the transatlantic relationship, Europe-America, is certainly going through a very strained period right now. The most strained period, perhaps, since the Second World War. And this is because, Europe and America currently have different views on how they see the world and see their role in the world. Europe still sees its role as a normative force, as a force that relies on soft power rather than on hard power. America, under Trump, sees its role in a different way. The problem is that Europe has a very serious challenge with Ukraine.
Yes.
The war in Ukraine has been going on for 3 years, and it is nowhere near a resolution that is sustainable and meaningful. And Europe does need to wake up to the fact that if you say that this is the biggest strategic threat to Europe. If Europe sort of openly, Europe openly says, the war in Ukraine is the biggest security and strategic threat to the European countries, then that means that you have to adapt how you react to that strategic threat. And that adaptation has not happened until now because the reliance was more on America. That, I think, Trump coming into the equation is now forcing European leaders to reconsider that role. And some will obviously say, well, we need European defense away from America, self-reliance, etc., etc. Others will say, well, we need to step up. We need to take up our role, but we need to do that in partnership with the United States, which I think is the more important direction in which this debate should go. If you look at the numbers are quite interesting now, because if Europe increases its defense spending, if each European country that is a member of NATO increases its defense spending to, I think, about 4%, we will be on par or even more than the United States.
Yeah, but what's stopping them from doing that?
What's stopping them is that you have, first of all, you have 27 different domestic debates, different budgets, but then it's not even just an issue of money. It is an issue of what you do with that money. And this is where the challenge for Europe now begins. It's not just about increasing your spending, which you need to get through Parliament, approved, and people obviously are not going to be very happy about that. But it is about joint procurement, because if you have 27 different systems of military procurement in the European Union that are not coordinated, you will end up spending more money. Then there's the debate of where you buy. Do you buy only European products, or do you go in the international market to find the most cost-effective ones? Then there's the question of what capacities you're building, because until now, the way that NATO functioned was that there was a sort of a plan that included America. But if you have to have within that NATO context a European version that builds up certain capabilities that Europe until now did not possess, European countries did not build, that means a completely different structure of your armed forces. Now, what I fear is that this debate should have started much earlier. They should not have waited for President Trump to force it. First of all, because even in his first administration, there were a lot of issues about defense spending. Secondly, with the start of Ukraine, many military leaders in Europe within the military were saying, listen, we will need to start thinking about returning to conscription. We need to start thinking about how we're procuring and what we're procuring. But that was not reflected in the public dynamic. So you see, the relationship is very stressed now. But I don't think that this is a break. And I'm very skeptical when I hear some European politicians who very quickly sort of try to dismiss the relationship with the United States. The strategic interest of Europe and the United States to continue working together, maybe under different rules, maybe under revised roles, is far greater than the strategic interest to sort of disassociate completely. And on democracy, J.D. Vance in Munich gave this long list of criticism.
And make Europe great again statement.
Right, exactly. But he had this long list of criticism of European democracy.
What's your evaluation on that? What's your take on that, his criticism?
My take is that Europe has probably a longer list of criticisms of American democracy. So if we're going to go down the road of criticizing each other's democracy, instead of talking about the challenges around us, we're not helping anyone. There's a war in Ukraine. There is multiple problems in the Middle East that need to be resolved. There are rising problems in Africa. And this is just on the security front. On the economic and technology front, Europe is far behind the United States and China. It needs to get its act together in that sphere. We need to see how we're going to adapt to a trading global trading environment, which is much more fragmented now than it has been for many, many years.
Okay. Speaking on these issues, you mentioned the Ukraine crisis. Recently, Trump team met with their Russian counterparts in Riyadh to negotiate this prospect of ending the war in Europe. However, neither Ukraine nor Europe were included in the negotiations. How do you interpret the exclusion of Europe in these American-Russian negotiations? What message do you think this exclusion sent to Europeans, and how do you assess the European response to this diplomatic development?
Well, from a European perspective, I'm sure it felt uncomfortable, but I think from an American or a Russian perspective, it would have looked awkward to have the European Union at the table. I think, the media in particular is reading way too much in what happened in Riyadh at that meeting, because if you look at the results of the meeting, there's basically only one decision: to start a discussion on how to normalize the functioning of our embassies. Amazing achievement. And to have a longer discussion about other issues.
Yes.
What I think this symbolizes is that we're going through a period in which what President Trump is putting on the table is a return to the policies of the past, where you had big countries sitting together, deciding among themselves the fate of small countries.
Yeah. Okay. But
yes, Europe is big.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about the war in Ukraine, the largest chunk of military assistance, not civilian, civilian assistance and financing comes from Europe, and a lot of military assistance comes from Europe, but the largest chunk of military assistance comes from the United States. So if America pulls out of that support from Ukraine, Europe cannot immediately, maybe over time it can, but not immediately fill that in. So I think, this period in which you have these big attempt to have these big deals is going to be a very difficult period. But having said that, you also need to acknowledge that, the war in Ukraine is not as some try to present it, particularly around President Trump. It's about land and territory. It's about identity, it's about history, it's about far more complicated issues that you're not going to solve, by just sort of saying, like, let's move the border from point A to point B. And I think this is where it becomes far more dangerous, is that what Russia is putting on the table or asking for is very different from what America is asking for or ready to give. And that is why this conversation, this dialogue is going to take a long time, and probably will require a much more sophisticated understanding of what are the issues related to the situation in Ukraine. And ultimately it will require an engagement of the Ukrainians themselves, because this is their country. You see, the fear in Europe now is that the meeting in Riyadh revives a history which many in Europe still feel very close to. The end of Yalta, end of Second World War, Soviet Union and America and Britain sitting up and dividing Eastern Europe, and your country may end up on one side of the Iron Curtain, the other country may end up on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and that went on for a very long period of time. We thought we had gotten away from that period, and nobody wants to see a return back to that period. I think, obviously, historical parallels are very slippery. We're not in that same space right now, but some people see that parallel, and that makes them fearful.
Okay. Thank you very much. As we reach to the end of our session today, I would like to thank you, Mr. Nikolai Mildanov, for such detailed answers and insightful conversation. And I hope to welcome you again here at ECSSR for more conversation like this. I also want to extend my thanks to the audience. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you again at future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.